Hi friends! I'm going to read you a story from one of my favourite authors, Roald Dahl. This is called Esio, Trot. Mr. Hoppy lived in a small flat high up in a tall concrete building. He lived alone. He had always been a lonely man, and now that he was retired from work, he was more lonely than ever. There were two loves in Mr. Hoppy's life. One was the flowers he grew on his balcony. They grew in pots and tubs and baskets, and in the summer the balcony became a riot of colour. Mr. Hoppy's second love was a secret he kept entirely to himself. The balcony immediately below Mr. Hoppy's jutted out a good bit further than the building from his own, so that Mr. Hoppy always had a fine view of what was going on down there. This balcony belonged to an attractive middle-aged lady called Mrs. Silver. Mrs. Silver was a widow who lived alone. A widow is somebody who's a woman whose husband has passed away, who's died. And although she didn't know it, she was the object of Mr. Hoppy's secret love. He had loved her from his balcony for many years, but he was a very shy man, and he had never been able to bring himself to give her even the smallest hint of his love. I'm going to show you a picture of Mr. Hoppy up in his colourful balcony full of plants, and there's Mrs. Silver underneath. Every morning, Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver exchanged polite conversation, the one looking down from above, the other looking up. But that was as far as it ever went. The distance between their balconies might not have been more than a few yards, but to Mr. Hoppy it seemed like a million miles. He longed to invite Mrs. Silver up for a cup of tea and a biscuit, but every time he was about to form the words on his lips, his courage failed him. As I said, he was a very, very shy man. Oh, if only, he kept telling himself, if only he could do something tremendous, like saving her life. If only he could perform some great feat that would make him a hero in her eyes. If only. The trouble with Mrs. Silver was that she gave all her love to somebody else. And that somebody was a small tortoise called Alfie. Every day when Mr. Hoppy looked over his balcony and saw Mrs. Silver whispering endearments to Alfie and stroking his shell, he felt absurdly jealous. So she's whispering kind things and sweet things in Alfie's ear, telling her tortoise how much she loves him, and Mr. Hoppy is jealous. He wouldn't have even minded becoming a tortoise himself if it meant Mrs. Silver stroking his shell each morning and whispering endearments to him. Alfie had been with Mrs. Silver for years, and he lived on her balcony summer and winter. Planks had been placed around the sides of the balcony so that Alfie could walk out without toppling over the edge. Remember, she lives in an apartment, so it's up high. And in one corner there was a little house into which Alfie could crawl every night to keep warm. When the colder weather came along in November, Mrs. Silver would fill Alfie's home with dry hay, and the tortoise would crawl up in there and bury himself deep under the hay and go to sleep for months on end without food or water. This is called hibernating. In early spring, when Alfie felt the warmer weather through his shell, he would wake up and crawl very slowly out of his house onto the balcony. And Mrs. Silver would clap her hands with joy and cry out, "Welcome back, my darling one! Oh, how I've missed you!" It was at times like this that Mr. Hoppy wished more than ever that he could change places with Alfie and become a tortoise. Now we come to a certain bright morning in May when something happened that changed and indeed electrified Mr. Hoppy's life. He was leaning over his balcony rail watching Mrs. Silver serving Alfie his breakfast. "Here's a heart of lettuce for you, my lovely," she was saying. And here's a slice of fresh tomato and a piece of crispy celery. Good morning, Mrs. Silver, Mr. Hoppy said. Alfie's looking well this morning. Isn't he gorgeous? Mrs. Silver said, smiling and looking up at him. Absolutely gorgeous, said Mr. Hoppy, not meaning it. And now as he looked down at Mrs. Silver's smiling face gazing up at his own, he thought for the 1000th time how pretty she was, how sweet and gentle and full of kindness, and his heart ached with love. I do so wish he would grow a little faster, Mrs. Silver was saying. Every spring he wakes up from his winter sleep. I weigh him on the kitchen scales. And do you know that in the 11 years that I've had him, he's not gained more than 3 ounces? That's almost nothing. What does he weigh now? Mr. Hoppy asked her. Just 13 ounces, Mrs. Silver answered. About as much as a grapefruit. Yes, well, tortoises are very slow growers, Mr. Hoppy said solemnly. But they can live for 100 years. I know that, Mrs. Silver said, but I do wish that he would grow a little bit bigger. He's such a teeny wee fellow. He seems just fine as he is, Mr. Hoppy said. No, he's not just fine, Mrs. Silver cried. Try to think how miserable it must make him feel to feel so titchy. Everyone wants to grow up. You really would love him to grow bigger, wouldn't you? Mr. Hoppy said. And even as he said it, his mind suddenly went click, and an amazing idea came rushing into his head. Of course I would, Mrs. Silver cried. I'd give anything to make it happen. Why, I've seen pictures of giant tortoises that are so big that people can ride on their backs. If Alfie were to see those, he'd turn green with envy. Mr. Hoppy's mind was spinning like a flywheel. Here surely was his big chance. Grab it, he told himself. Grab it quick. Mrs. Silver, he said, I do actually happen to know how to make tortoises grow faster, if that's what you really want. You do? She cried. Oh, please tell me. Am I feeding him the wrong things? I worked in North Africa once, said Mr. Hoppy. That's where all these tortoises in England come from. And a Bedouin tribesman told me the secret. Tell me, cried Mrs. Silver. I beg you to tell me, Mr. Hoppy. Wait here, he said. I'll have to go in and write something down for you. In a couple of minutes, Mr. Hoppy was back on the balcony with a sheet of paper in his hand. I'm going to lower it down to you on a bit of string, he said, or it might blow away. Here it comes. Mrs. Silver caught the paper and held it up in front of her. And this is what she read. Esio Trot, Tej Rajib, Emok no, Esio Trot, Wog Poo, Fup Poo, Toos Poo, Knips Poo, Wulp Poo, Loose Poo, Eggrog, Ezug, Foots, Plug, Tup no Taff, Esio Trot, Tuff no Taff, Tej no, Elbog Doof. What does it mean? She asked. Is it another language? It's tortoise language, Mr. Hoppy said. Tortoises are very backward creatures. Therefore, they can only understand words that are written backwards. That's obvious, isn't it? There she is, and there is what I just tried to read. I suppose so, said Mrs. Silver, bewildered. Esio Trot is simply tortoise spelled backwards, Mr. Hoppy said. Look at it. So it is, Mrs. Silver said. The other words are spelled backwards too, Mr. Hoppy said. If you turn them around into human language, they simply say, tortoise, get bigger, Come on, tortoise. Grow up, puff up, shoot up, spring up, blow up, swell up. Gorge, guzzle, stuff, gulp. Put on fat, tortoise, put on fat. Get on, gobble food. I'll show you now what it looks like. There it is again, backwards. Mrs. Silver examined the magic words on the paper more closely. I guess you're right, she said. How clever. But there's an awful lot of poos in it. Are they something special? Poo is a very strong word in any language, Mr. Hobby said, especially with tortoises. Now, what you have to do, Mrs. Silver, is hold Alfie up to your face and whisper these words to him 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. Let me hear you practice them. Very slowly and stumbling a little over the strange words, Mrs. Silver had read the whole message out loud in tortoise language. Not bad, Mr. Hobby said, but try to get a little more expression in it when you say it to Alfie. If you do it properly, I'll bet you anything you like that in a few months' time he'll be twice as big as he is now. I'll try it, said Mrs. Silver. I'll try anything, of course I will, but I can't believe it'll work. You wait and see, said Mr. Hoppy, smiling at her. Back in his flat, Mr. Hoppy was simply quivering all over with excitement. But there was a lot of work to be done before that happened. The only furniture in Mr. Hobby's small living room was a table and 2 chairs. These he moved into his bedroom. Then he went out and bought a sheet of thick canvas and spread it over the entire living room floor to protect the carpet. Next, he got out the telephone book and wrote down the address of every pet shop in the city. There were 14 of them altogether. It took him 2 days to visit each pet shop and choose his tortoises. He wanted a great many, at least 100, perhaps more, and he had to choose them very carefully. To you and me, there is not much difference between one tortoise and another. They differ only in their size and in the colour of their shells. Alfie had a darkish shell, so Mr. Hobby chose only the darker coloured tortoises for his great collection. Size, of course, was everything. Mr. Hobby chose all sorts of different sizes, some weighing only slightly more than Alfie's 13 ounces, others a great deal more. But he didn't want any that weighed less. Feed them cabbage leaves, the pet shop owners told him. That's all they'll need, and a bowl of water. When he had finished, Mr. Hoppy, in his enthusiasm, had bought no less than 140 tortoises, and he carried them home in baskets, 10 or 15 at a time. He had to make a lot of trips, and he was quite exhausted at the end of it all. But it was worth it. Boy, was it worth it. And what an amazing sight his living room was when they were all together. The floor was swarming with tortoises of different sizes, some walking slowly about and exploring, some munching cabbage leaves, others drinking water from a big, shallow dish. I'll just show you, this is him in the pet shop. You can see all the cool pets. I see, that looks like a snake in that cage up there, and a parrot, rabbit. They made the faintest rustling sound as they moved over the canvas sheet, but that was all. Mr. Poppy had to pick his way carefully on his toes between his moving sea of brown shells whenever he walked across the room. But enough of that. He must get on with the job. And I'm just going to show you a picture of the tortoises on his living room floor, and you can see him dishing out the leaves of the cabbage leaves to all the tortoises. And friends, I'm going to stop there today. So join me again for the rest of the story.